Voting Rights Act remedied a great illusion of freedom in the South. The only reason we are free today is because of the Voting Rights Act. We look at ourselves as a free country because we have the right to say and do whatever we want based off of our right to vote. You can make your own decisions. When you strip that away, specifically, you bring us back to no more than slaves. The thing that makes us citizens are our right to vote. That controls regulations, that controls housing, that controls the school system, that controls pollution, that controls the economy, that controls permits. It controls everything. Everything we have is due to us being a fair and equal society based off our right to vote in a democracy. Without that right to vote, we are no different than slaves, which is why they had the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendment in the first place. That was hijacked by Reconstruction. And then we have the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Today's ruling undoes that. When Reconstruction happened, there was an explicit attempt in the racial voting dynamics of the South by cutting out the Negro. By doing so, there was no competing for Negroes in society. There's no reason for Negroes to have a place in society legally. We don't need to appeal to them politically. We don't need people to get their votes and then therefore have their views and their society and their way of life imposed on the rest of us here in the South. Some political parties wanted to use Black people as a political pawn against the other political party, but most Black people came to some consensus. This is not what we needed. Now, while they first decided to go into sheer racial terror, literal bombing and outright fraud at the ballot box, inevitably they came to a decision of what would be easier is if we straight up disenfranchise Black people en masse. We can get rid of the Negro problem once and for all because the federal government has installed themselves into our business. What they did was to create a final solution in which they would effectively bar Black people from voting. And since we did have the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, they had to be a little bit more strategic about this by making poll taxes, by making laws and regulations that on the surface was not exactly racist explicitly, because that was unconstitutional. However, the impact itself would therefore lead to disenfranchisement en masse in Black people. And they did that successfully, and the South was relatively peaceful from an intra-white perspective. Black people were successfully second-class citizens, and they didn't have to worry about the Negro problem. As African Americans, we had to deal with extreme racism, extreme discrimination, and how they got these laws passed, specifically under the concept that we are not necessarily being outright against the Negro. We are specifically creating laws that just so happen to negatively impact the Negro. That is how they went about it. And that is what we saw in the South. Because of that, we also had outright violence sanctioned by the state, because what else can you do? What are the laws going to do about that? Fast forward to the Voting Rights Act in 1965, especially updated on the 1982 ruling, they go off for the impact of race. How this affects people from actually being able to vote, regardless of what are the legal specific situations of it. Today's strike down of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act is consequential insofar as they say that you can no longer look at the impact of race when it comes to voting decisions and other legislation and other court moves. You have to look at the specific intent on whether they specifically chose to be racist, which, if you go back into it, was not the case in which we had Jim Crow in the first place. Right now, you see me, I'm not just on a random street. I am in Lemon Grove, California. This is the first city that was desegregated in America. It's a Mexican-American city desegregated in 1931. It's 23 years before Brown v. Board of Education, but it was a landmark case that established the impacts of segregation, not just the outright specific thing on we're going to exclude Mexican-Americans. They had poor quality schools, not just because they were explicitly anti-Mexicans, to focus on the impact of race, and therefore we have this free and fair society, which the Supreme Court cites in today's decision, as we have made all this progress, but that has happened because of us making the impact of racial decisions on our society. You see me on this washing machine in this random Southern California neighborhood, but it was not so random. Lemon Grove was also the story of a civil rights case that was successful in 2023 after a Black man who was renting from a white man decided to sell him a property and force him to move in, despite the fact that there was blood and all types of other shit on the walls. They ruled that illegal based off of the Civil Rights Division. Civil rights, which looks at the impact of somebody's life and the situation they have to find themselves in. This Supreme Court case, which makes it harder to go off of the impact of race and now go into the specific legal intent to disenfranchise and to be racist, has deeper consequences going on down the line. Until we can put that into perspective, we might not get the full impact of the story. The thing that separates us from slaves, the things that make us people, and the thing that makes our lives more important beyond just what the law specifically intended or did not intend to do. Thank you.